A 14-year-old girl stood in the middle of the courtroom, pointed straight at a powerful judge, and declared, "You are the killer." The entire courtroom froze. Not a single word was spoken. Every eye was locked on her, stunned, disbelieving. But what could have made this young girl risk everything to expose such a terrifying truth? Stay with us as we unravel this gripping story. And don't forget to follow, because tomorrow we have another powerful story that you won't want to miss. The courtroom held its breath. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the man who had commanded justice for decades, Judge Victor Calloway. His presence alone carried weight. His judgments final, his reputation untouchable. This was supposed to be just another case, another criminal facing a verdict. The air inside the chamber was thick with expectation. The attorneys sat poised, the jury composed, reporters ready with cameras in hand, routine, order, control. And then it shattered. "You are the killer!" The voice cut through the silence like a blade. Gasps rippled across the room. The stenographer's fingers hovered motionless over the keys. Lawyers turned, exchanging stunned glances. Even the jury, trained to remain neutral, failed to mask their shock. Every lens in the courtroom shifted, all cameras now locked on the one who had spoken. Elena Carter. Just 14 years old, she stood in the center of the courtroom, small yet unshaken. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, but her voice had not wavered. Her hands trembled, yet her eyes, locked onto Calloway, burned with something fierce. The judge's grip on the gavel tightened, his knuckles whitening. His composed mask did not slip, but something flickered in his eyes. Shock, anger, or perhaps, for the briefest second, fear. Elena took a step forward. "I know what you did." The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. A pause, a moment stretched too long. Then, chaos erupted. Calloway's assistant shot to his feet. Lawyers scrambled in confusion. The jury whispered amongst themselves. The bailiff's voice boomed. "Order in the court." But no one was listening. Security surged forward, moving toward the girl. But Elena didn't flinch, didn't step back. She had just set something into motion, and there was no stopping it now. For as long as Elena Carter could remember, her father had been her hero. Detective Ethan Carter wasn't just a good cop. He was a man of principle. Someone who believed that justice wasn't about power, but about doing what was right. He had spent years chasing criminals, standing against corruption, refusing to be bought. He always told her, "Justice isn't about punishment, Elena. It's about making things right." She had believed him. She still did. But justice hadn't saved him. 6 months ago, Ethan Carter vanished. One night, he left for work and never came back. No goodbye, no warning. Just gone. At first, the police launched an investigation, but weeks passed and the story changed. The official report was released. Detective Carter abandoned his post, walked away from his life. They called him a deserter, a coward. But Elena knew better. Her father would never leave. Never. But no one listened. Not the police, not the reporters, not even the people who had once worked alongside him. Her mother had died years ago. Now, with her father gone, Elena and her little brother were alone. And every night, she still left the porch light on. Just in case he came back. Just in case this had all been a mistake. But deep down, she knew. Someone had taken him. And if no one else was going to find the truth, then she would. It started with a sound, a quiet creak beneath the floorboards of her father's study. It had been weeks since anyone had stepped into the room. The scent of his aftershave still lingered in the air, a painful reminder that he had been here once. That this had been his space. The police had already searched through his things, taken whatever they deemed important. But Elena knew her father better than they did. If he had found something dangerous, something that could put him in harm's way, he wouldn't have left it out in the open. She knelt on the floor, pressing her palm against the wooden planks. Slowly, carefully, she pried up the loose board, and there it was, a thin, worn folder. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, pages of handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and court records filled the file. And then, one name, scrawled in red ink, appeared over and over again. Judge Victor Calloway. A cold chill ran down her spine. Her father had been investigating Calloway. She didn't know why, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain, this was no coincidence. Whatever her father had uncovered, it had led him straight to one of the most powerful judges in the city. And now, her father was gone. The realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had silenced him. She didn't have time to react. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. The house was supposed to be empty. She was supposed to be alone. Slowly, she turned. The office door was still open, the hallway beyond it dark and silent, but something felt off. Elena forced herself to move, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. She stepped out of the office, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The hallway was empty. The living room, silent. Then she saw it. Her bedroom door. It was open. She had closed it before coming downstairs. She was sure of it. A sharp chill ran through her body. Her fingers curled into fists, but her hands were clammy. She swallowed hard, forcing herself forward. When she reached the doorway, she hesitated, just for a second, before stepping inside, and stopped cold. Everything looked the same. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. Except for one thing. A note, taped to the mirror. Black ink, bold against the stark white paper. Stop digging. Her stomach twisted. She took a shaky step closer, reaching for the paper with trembling fingers, then froze. The closet door, it was open. Just an inch. A lump formed in her throat. She had closed it that morning. She was sure of it. A sickening realization settled over her. Someone had been in her house. Someone had been in her room. And they hadn't stolen anything. They had left a message. This wasn't just about her father anymore. Someone was watching her. And if she didn't stop, she knew exactly what would happen next. But she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Because now, she wasn't just searching for the truth. She was fighting for her father's life. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the cracked pavement as Elena pulled her hood tighter around her face. The old diner stood at the corner of a quiet street, its neon sign flickering, casting an eerie glow on the wet sidewalk. This was the place. She hesitated for only a second before pushing through the glass door. The scent of burnt coffee and stale grease filled the air. A few late-night patrons sat hunched over their meals, but her eyes locked onto the man in the far booth, the man she had spent weeks tracking down. Daniel Reeves, a former FBI agent, once one of the best. He had worked with her father years ago, back when the world still made sense. But now, he was just another ghost of a man, drowning in a life he hadn't chosen. His broad shoulders slumped beneath a worn leather jacket, graying stubble shadowed his sharp jawline. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like someone who had stopped believing in them a long time ago. Elena approached slowly, her heart hammering. He didn't glance up, just stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. His voice was rough, edged with something tired, something broken. Elena slid into the seat across from him. "You knew my father." Finally, he looked at her. His deep-set eyes, once sharp enough to see through the lies of criminals, studied her carefully. "I did." "Then you know he didn't just disappear." Silence. She clenched her fists beneath the table, forcing herself to keep steady. "I found his files. He was looking into Judge Calloway." Reeves exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "And now you are too." Elena nodded. "I need your help." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Kid, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," she shot back. Reeves didn't answer. He just studied her, really looked at her, as if searching for something. And then, something flickered in his expression. Determination. Recognition. Because for the first time in years, he saw Ethan Carter again. Not in flesh and blood, but in the fire burning in his daughter's eyes. Reeves sighed, setting down his coffee. "All right, kid," he muttered. "Tell me everything." Reeves didn't speak for a long time. He just sat there, staring at the half-empty coffee cup in front of him, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Elena waited, forcing herself to be patient, even as her pulse pounded in her ears. She had given him everything. Her father's notes, the name Victor Calloway, the warning that had been left in her bedroom. And still, he hesitated. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low and quiet. "Calloway is bad," he said, "but he's not the worst of them." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" Reeves looked up, his expression unreadable. "Calloway isn't the one pulling the strings." She felt a cold chill run through her. "Then who is?" Reeves didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing it flat before sliding it across the table. A name was written in sharp, dark ink. Alexander Blackwood. Elena had never seen the name before, but something about it sent a strange sense of dread curling in her stomach. "Who is he?" she whispered. Reeves leaned back, his jaw tightening. "A man you don't want to know." Elena didn't flinch. "Tell me anyway." Reeves studied her again, as if deciding whether or not to say the words. Then, finally, he sighed. "Alexander Blackwood isn't a politician, isn't a judge, isn't someone who needs to be elected or appointed. He's something worse. He's the kind of man who operates from the shadows, who doesn't care about public opinion because the people in power already answer to him." Elena's hands curled into fists. "My father was investigating him," Reeves nodded, "and that's why he's gone." The weight of the words settled over her, suffocating. She had thought Calloway was the one responsible for her father's disappearance. But now she realized the truth was much, much bigger. Her father hadn't just stumbled into something dangerous. He had uncovered a monster. Elena had never met Linda Grayson in person. Their conversations had been brief, hurried exchanges over the phone, whispers in the dark about truths too dangerous to say out loud. But even in those short moments, Elena had felt something rare, something she hadn't felt in months, someone willing to listen. Linda had promised her proof, not suspicions, not theories, evidence. "Calloway isn't as untouchable as he thinks," she had said just the night before. "Meet me tomorrow, downtown, 3 p.m. I'll bring everything." For the first time since her father disappeared, Elena had felt something she no longer allowed herself to believe in. Hope. She had barely slept that night. Every possibility had played in her mind. What if Linda had the key to everything? What if this was the break she needed? What if, finally, she was about to get answers? But hope had never been kind to her. The next afternoon, she arrived early. The coffee shop was small, tucked away in a quieter part of town, the kind of place where people went to be unnoticed. She sat near the window, her fingers curled around the edge of the table, leg bouncing anxiously as she waited, and waited, and waited. Linda never came. Her name did, though, on the news that evening. A tragic accident, the reporter called it. Hit and run. No suspects. Dead on impact. Elena stared at the screen, numb, as the anchor spoke in measured, professional tones. The way they reported it, too clean, too rehearsed, too perfect. Almost as if someone had written the script before it even happened. Reeves was the one who turned off the TV. She hadn't even realized she was shaking until the screen went dark, and she saw her reflection. Wide eyes, pale face, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Kid," Reeves said quietly, "you need to stop. This is real now." Real. As if it hadn't already been real when she found her father's files. When someone broke into her house. When they left a note on her mirror, warning her to stop. But now, they weren't just warning her. Now, they were sending a message. Linda Grayson had been silenced, and if Elena didn't stop, she would be next. For the first time since this all started, fear curled in her stomach like ice. She could run, she could disappear. It would be the smart thing to do. But as she stared at her reflection, at the girl who had already lost too much, her mother, her father, and now the one person who had tried to help, something inside her snapped. Running wouldn't bring her father back. Running wouldn't bring Linda back. But fighting? Maybe, just maybe, it could save someone else. She turned to Reeves, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not stopping." And for the first time, he didn't try to argue. The air inside the courthouse was electric. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, their shutters clicking like the ticking of a countdown. Reporters whispered in hushed yet urgent tones, fingers poised over keyboards, ready to immortalize the moment. Outside, a restless crowd pressed against metal barricades, voices merging into an indistinct roar. Inside, the tension was suffocating. And at the center of it all, sitting behind the defendant's table with an air of forced composure, was Judge Victor Calloway. Elena stood near the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched at her sides, her breath coming in steady, controlled inhales. This was it. Every document, every testimony, every buried case her father had tried to expose, she had unearthed them all. And now, justice was catching up. FBI agents moved forward, dark suits a stark contrast against the rich wood of the courtroom. One of them stepped up to Calloway, pulling out a pair of gleaming handcuffs. The agent's voice rang through the chamber, cutting through the heavy silence. "Judge Victor Calloway, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding in organized crime." The reaction was immediate. A collective gasp swept through the room. Lawyers exchanged stunned glances. The jury sat motionless, eyes wide. Even the reporters, who had likely been tipped off about the arrest, stopped typing for a fraction of a second. Elena exhaled, a weight lifting off her chest. For the first time in months, she felt it. Relief. For so long, she had been clawing through darkness, desperate for even a sliver of truth. She had been ignored, silenced, hunted, but now, she had won. Or so she thought. Because as the FBI agent grabbed Calloway's wrist, something happened that made her blood run cold. The judge, the man who had spent his life as the face of law and order, the untouchable force behind so many convictions, did not panic. He didn't lash out, didn't beg, didn't even attempt to argue. He smiled. Elena's pulse stuttered. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't the arrogance of a man who thought he could beat the charges. It was something deeper, something calculated. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto her like a predator recognizing an opponent. "You think this is over?" His voice was calm, almost amused. Elena forced her spine straight. She wouldn't show weakness. "I think you're finished," she shot back, her voice steady. Calloway chuckled. Not a bitter laugh, not an angry one, a knowing one. "They always come for the pawns first," he murmured. The words settled over her like a creeping shadow. Pawns. Her fingers curled into fists. "They take down the small pieces first," Calloway continued, his voice smooth, even as the cold steel of the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "But the man who moves the pieces, he's still out there." Elena's stomach twisted. A name, one Reeves had spoken in hushed tones, one that had been scrawled across her father's notes, one that had remained in the background of every dark secret she uncovered, rose to the surface of her mind. Alexander Blackwood. Her victory, the moment she had spent months fighting for, turned to dust in her hands. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The victory hadn't even settled before the world turned against them. It happened fast. Too fast. Only a few hours had passed since Calloway was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs. His empire was crumbling, headlines flashing across screens, reporters dissecting every angle. The world was watching. Elena and Reeves had left the courthouse quietly, slipping through the chaos unnoticed. They knew better than to celebrate in public. This wasn't over. And then, just as night fell, the attack came. They had taken back roads, winding through the city's quieter streets, avoiding main roads and surveillance cameras. Reeves had insisted on switching vehicles twice, his instincts sharp from years of chasing criminals who didn't want to be found. But it wasn't enough. The first sign was the headlights, two black SUVs appearing in the rearview mirror, moving too fast. Reeves muttered a curse under his breath. "We've got company." Tires screeched. He yanked the wheel hard, veering onto a narrow alleyway. The car jolted violently, skimming too close to the brick walls, but the SUVs followed, relentless, precise. Then, a sudden impact from behind. The force sent their car skidding sideways. Reeves fought for control, his hands gripping the wheel tight, but it was too late. The car spun out, tires shrieking, metal scraping against pavement. Then, a hard crash. Darkness swallowed everything for a split second. Elena's vision swam as she blinked through the daze, her ears ringing. The car had come to a violent stop against a concrete barrier. The acrid scent of burnt rubber and gasoline filled the air. Reeves groaned beside her, pressing a hand to his forehead, his breath uneven. He was hurt. Bad. But there was no time. The SUVs had stopped. Figures emerged, silent, calculated. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from when no one would dare to stop them. Elena's breath came fast and shallow. These weren't random thugs. Reeves exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. "They're not here to talk." Elena clenched her jaw. They had to move. Now. "Come on," she whispered, already reaching for the door. "We need to get out of here." Reeves hesitated, but he nodded, pushing through the pain. With adrenaline surging through her veins, Elena slipped into the shadows of the alley, half carrying Reeves as they stumbled forward. The figures behind them moved fast, their footsteps precise, closing in. Elena's chest burned with the effort. This wasn't just retaliation. Blackwood knew, and now he wanted her gone. They had managed to escape. Barely. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears as she half-carried Reeves into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. His weight pressed heavily against her, his breaths uneven, strained. They had been running for blocks, slipping through alleyways, dodging the figures hunting them down. But now there was nowhere left to run. Reeves slumped against the cold concrete wall, wincing as he pressed a hand to his side. His face was pale, his strength fading fast. He had lost too much blood. Elena crouched beside him, trying to steady her own ragged breathing. "We need to get you to a hospital." Reeves gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Kid, hospitals won't help us now." She knew he was right. If Blackwood's men had found them this quickly, there was no guarantee a hospital would be safe. Reeves looked at her then, his gaze sharper despite the pain. "You need to go," he said, his voice low but firm. Elena's brows furrowed. "What?" "Run. Disappear. If they catch you, it's over." His fingers curled slightly into a fist. "Stay alive, Elena. You can't fight if you're dead." A part of her knew he was right, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. She met his gaze, fire burning in her chest despite the exhaustion clawing at her body. "Running won't stop them." Reeves shook his head. "It'll buy you time." Elena exhaled slowly, steadying her breath. No, time wasn't what she needed. "They killed my father," she said softly. "They killed Linda, and now they're hunting us down like we're nothing." Reeves didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew what was coming. Elena swallowed hard. "If I run now, then they win." She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "My father wouldn't have run. He would have fought until his last breath." She met Reeves' eyes again, steel in her voice. "And so will I." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite the fear pressing down on them, Reeves gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then let's end this." Elena exhaled. It was time. She was going to expose everything, even if it killed her. The warehouse was silent. Too silent. Elena crouched low behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, steadying her breath. The dim overhead lights flickered, casting distorted shadows on the floor. Somewhere ahead, voices murmured. Low, deliberate, controlled. This was it. For days, she and Reeves had been tracking this moment. Blackwood was here. The man who had orchestrated everything. Her father's disappearance, Calloway's crimes, the corruption rotting the justice system from within. And tonight, they would expose him. Reeves was ahead of her, moving like a shadow along the edge of the warehouse, his every step precise despite his injuries. Even now, even wounded, he was sharp, focused. Elena forced herself to match his energy. She had been reckless before, too emotional, too reactive. But not tonight. Tonight she would be smart, precise. They had a plan. Get close. Capture Blackwood's confession. End this. She exhaled, gripping the small recording device hidden in her pocket. One chance. And then, a voice sliced through the silence. "You can come out now, Miss Carter." Elena's blood turned to ice. Reeves stopped moving. He had heard it too. Her pulse pounded. This was wrong. They had been careful. Every step calculated. Blackwood wasn't supposed to know they were here. And yet, he did. She peered between the containers. Blackwood stood near the center of the warehouse, dressed in a tailored dark suit, the very image of untouchable power. His expression was unreadable. His posture relaxed, too relaxed. Behind him, half a dozen men in black suits stood motionless, their presence a silent but undeniable warning. This wasn't a meeting. It was an ambush. Before she could react, a sudden rustling to her left made her whip around, just in time to see two men emerge from the shadows, grabbing Reeves. He fought back, landing a solid hit to one of them, but he was already weak. Within seconds, one of the men struck back, sending him staggering to his knees. Elena's breath caught. No. No, no, no. Reeves grimaced, his jaw tight, a cut blooming along his temple. But his eyes found hers with one clear message. Don't do anything stupid. Footsteps echoed against the cold concrete. Blackwood approached slowly, his movements effortless, controlled. He wasn't just powerful, he was in complete command. Elena forced herself to stand, even as her stomach twisted. If she ran, Reeves was dead. If she fought, she'd lose. Blackwood smiled. Smart girl, he mused, his voice smooth, almost amused. You've caused quite the mess. Elena's fists clenched. Let him go. Blackwood let out a soft chuckle, tilting his head slightly. Now, that's not how this works. He gave a small flick of his wrist, and one of his men pressed a gun to Reeves' head. Elena's stomach churned, but she held her ground. Blackwood stepped closer. You remind me of your father, he said, his voice almost fond. Always digging, always convinced the truth would set people free. His eyes darkened, and look where that got him. Rage flared through Elena, sharp and unrelenting. But she swallowed it down. She had to think. Blackwood exhaled, as if mildly disappointed. I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this the hard way. His voice was light, conversational, but every word dripped with lethal intent. You're going to hand over every file, every recording, every shred of evidence you have. He nodded toward Reeves. Or well, I'm sure you can imagine the alternative. Silence. Elena's nails dug into her palms. Blackwood's smile didn't fade. He knew what he was doing. And he knew she had no good options. You have 5 seconds to decide, he said pleasantly. 5. Elena's mind raced. 4. Reeves locked eyes with her, telling her not to give in. 3. Her fingers tightened around the recording device in her pocket. 2. She had no choice. She had to make her move. Now. Elena's heart pounded, but her grip on the small device in her pocket never wavered. They think they've won. Blackwood stood before her, poised like a king dictating the fate of his enemies. His voice remained calm, his demand absolute. Hand over the evidence or watch Reeves die. He believed he was in control. He wasn't. Elena swallowed, forcing herself to appear conflicted. She let her shoulders tense, her breath hitch, just enough to make him think she was breaking. Blackwood smirked. That's a good girl, he murmured. Now be smart, hand it over. She lifted her hand slowly. And then, the first vibration rattled through the air. A noise, distant but growing. A sound Elena had been waiting for. Sirens. Blackwood's smirk faltered. His men exchanged uneasy glances, their grip on their weapons tightening. Elena took a slow, deliberate breath, watching as the realization crept across Blackwood's face. You should really check your phone, she said, her voice almost casual. His expression flickered, then darkened. Elena pulled out her own phone, screen still glowing, camera still rolling. She turned it toward him. The comment section was moving too fast to read. Thousands of messages, millions of viewers. Blackwood's words, his threats, his confession, all of it had been live-streamed. To the entire world. For the first time, he hesitated. Elena saw it, the shift. The first crack in the carefully constructed armor of a man who always believed himself untouchable. His mind was racing, calculating, searching for a way out. There wasn't one. His empire wasn't just falling. It was burning. The sound of sirens grew deafening. Then, FBI, drop your weapons! The warehouse doors burst open. Armed agents flooded the space, their movements tactical and overwhelming. A full-blown raid. The men flanking Blackwood hesitated. Some lifted their hands in surrender. Others dropped their weapons entirely, their faces unreadable. Blackwood stood frozen. Reeves, still on his knees, let out a slow, pained chuckle. He spat blood onto the floor and looked up at Blackwood. Told you, he rasped. She's smarter than you. Elena barely registered the words. Her body was shaking, from the adrenaline, from the exhaustion, from the sheer weight of everything. But she had won. For the first time in months, she had truly won. And as the agents stormed forward, pushing Blackwood to his knees, slapping cuffs onto his wrists, Elena stood tall. Because now the whole world knew the truth. The news spread like wildfire. Alexander Blackwood, the untouchable power behind countless crimes, the man who had manipulated the justice system for decades, was finally in chains. His empire had collapsed in real time, exposed before millions. His allies, politicians, judges, corporate moguls, were already scrambling, their names surfacing one by one. For the first time in a long time, there was hope. Elena stood at a distance, watching as Blackwood was led out of the courthouse, his hands bound, his head held high, not in defiance, but in patience. Then, just as the cameras flashed, he turned. Their eyes met, and he smiled. Not a smirk, not anger. It was waiting, calculating. Elena's chest tightened, because men like Blackwood don't disappear. They regroup, they adapt, and they come back. The justice system was shifting, slowly, painfully, but corruption wasn't something that could be wiped out overnight. And her father, still missing. No body, no closure, just silence. Weeks passed. The world moved on, but Elena couldn't. She had spent so much time chasing the truth, fighting to expose the darkness that had consumed her father's life. Now, with Blackwood gone, there was nothing left to chase. Only questions. Only an absence she didn't know how to fill. Until one evening, it arrived. A plain envelope, no return address, slipped beneath her apartment door. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her breath unsteady. She tore it open. Inside, there was no explanation, no signature, only 2 words: keep going. Elena's breath hitched, her vision blurred as she traced the letters with her fingertips, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She knew this handwriting. She had memorized it from old birthday cards, from notes stuck to the fridge, from case files scribbled in hurried penmanship. It was his, her father's. Her lungs tightened, Her pulse roared in her ears. He was alive. Somewhere, somehow, he was alive. Elena stepped outside, the cold night air biting against her skin. Above her, the sky stretched wide and endless, stars flickering like distant promises. She let the letter slip through her fingers, gripping it tight against her chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. Blackwood's empire had fallen, but the system that had built him? Still standing. Her father was still out there, and if he thought she would stop now, if anyone thought she would stop now, they were wrong. She inhaled deeply, her breath steady, her resolve unshaken. She wasn't done. Not while the truth was still out there. Not while her father was still waiting to be found. Not while the fight was far from over. With one last glance at the sky, Elena turned, ready to begin again. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us bring you more gripping stories like this one. Share this video with someone who loves a good mystery, and most importantly, subscribe so you never miss our next big story. Your support means the world to us. Every like, share, and comment gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful content. Thank you for being a part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story.